some familiar faces and some faces that are new to me. So my name is Irit Jaffe-Berg, as some of you know. I'm the chair of the Department of Theater, Film, and Digital Production. I'll also mention the fact that I hold chair's office hours every Wednesday from 1 to 3 o'clock. And so if you have questions, or you just want to introduce yourselves, or you have papers to sign, or any of the above, please consider stopping by at some point this year from 1 to 3 Wednesdays, INTS 2120. My door is always open, so please, please do. Today is a great thrill for us, for me personally, and for us, I hope, as a group. Because this is a theater history class, and I think today we really get a chance to touch history. And I say that because our guest today is known as the last student of Edward Gordon Craig's. And Edward Gordon Craig, if we think about it, was born in the 1870s, and here we are in 2015. So today we will somehow span 3 centuries, which to me is mind-boggling when you think about it. We are one person away from being in touch with somebody who was born, 3 centuries essentially within that span. I know this is a theater history class. I know that Professor Gallela has talked to you a little bit about shadow puppets, and the concept of the Uber marionette. So today will be a wonderful chance of synthesizing all of that as we get to know a little bit more about Edward Gordon Craig's work and about Harvey Grossman's work. So our guest today is Harvey Grossman. Harvey Grossman is an American-born theater artist who has lived for the last few decades, I think, right? Mostly in Europe, and currently lives in Antwerp, and is based there, where he has developed a theater approach that's called the cruciform theater, about which I hope we'll be hearing a lot more today. As I said, Harvey is known as having been the last student of Edward Gordon Craig. Edward Gordon Craig is known to us from theater history books as somebody who really innovated and changed the way in which we think about theater making, scenography, scenic design, and play with light. Craig, along with Appia, were 2 of the big artists in the late 19th century, early 20th century, who used light as though it's a sculptural element in terms of creating the image that the audience saw. And when you think about the way in which light is manipulated today, not only in theater, but you think about, rock or amusement parks, or unbelievable spectacles that we see, light is the main element that is being used to really change a whole experience that the audience has, and the interface between the viewer and the performer. So today will hopefully help us to understand a little bit more where all of that comes from. Edward Gordon Craig is also very well known for this concept of the Uber marionette, the actor as puppet, and sometimes as actors we bristle at that. And maybe we'll talk a little bit more about how to understand this concept of the Uber marionette, this ultimate puppet. The actor is an ultimate puppet. What in the world does that mean, and how can we make friends with that concept as actors? Okay, so it's a tremendous pleasure for me. Harvey's a frequent visitor to the East Coast. And in fact, last week was just delivering his talk at NYU. In the past, Harvey, you've given talks at Claremont, at Pomona College, but this is the first time, to my knowledge, that we have Harvey in the UC system, and Riverside gets to hear from Harvey first. So we're extremely delighted that you're with us. Please join me in welcoming Harvey Grossman.
Thank you. From my side, I'm very happy to be here with you. And the reason that I wanted this photograph to be there when you would come into the room is because it's very much Craig, at a much younger age, of course, than I ever knew him. I think he was in his middle 30s. And the photograph was taken by someone very close to him, and that was Isadora Duncan, the dancer, whose name some of you may know. They were together, were great admirers of each other as artists, and they were lovers, importantly, to both their lives. And that's indeed him, and this rather rare photograph of him taken by Isadora. I think I'll tell you first that I discovered Craig first when I was 14 years of age in a history of theatre book. It's called The Theatre, 3,000 Years of Drama, Acting and Stagecraft. And it's republished now, I've seen. It's written by Sheldon Cheney. And in that book, at the end of the 20th century, I saw a photograph, a much later one than this, of Craig, and I saw some designs of his for Hamlet. And I just read that little text that they gave introducing him. I didn't know he was alive. It seemed like it was already so many years that they were talking about. But he was alive, and I thought that alive or not, this is my teacher. That was what I felt. And I'll just add to that when I entered the High School of Performing Arts in New York, my classmate was another aspiring director like me. That was Mark Epstein. And I talked to him about Craig, about Gordon Craig, and he said, yes, he said, I do know about Gordon Craig because my brother actually met him in Paris. So I knew that he was alive and living in France. And his brother is Alvin Epstein, whose name you may know also as an actor. Certainly he's well known on the East Coast and perhaps here too. He is still alive, and he's 90 years of age, Alvin Epstein, and he's going to perform at Lincoln Center late this month. I don't know exactly on what day. Lincoln Center, of course, is far from us. But I'll give that by way of background, and now I'm going to tell you about Craig. The radicalism of Gordon Craig's position is so far-going that it has yet to be fully absorbed by the theatre. From the start, he felt pulled between the theatre into which he was born, the son of a famous Victorian actress, Ellen Terry, and art as exemplified by music, painting, sculpture, and architecture. His father had been an architect, Edward William Godwin. These arts inspired him to the idea that, like each of them, the theatre should come to speak a language of its own, as sound speaks in music, space through architecture. An unknown language, yet open as space and sound are to human receptivity. Then, he thought, the theatre will become an art and stop being an auxiliary to these other arts. He stated to the world and to himself, likewise, quote, if you can find in nature a new material, one which has never yet been used by man to give form to his thoughts, then you can say you are on the high road towards creating a new art. This was his idea, so that it's a kind of paradox and even out of place that he's known often as a designer of stage scenery. He began by clearing the stage of scenery, leaving in its place actors, harking back to the actor's origin before there was any scenery, a lost origin even before Greece, and on the other hand, laying the groundwork for modern mime. This linking of past and future, almost as though ignoring the present-day theatre, is characteristic of Craig. Yet the theatre of our time considers itself strongly influenced by his ideas. One of the reasons that his name is associated with scenery is that he drew so many pictures. Here's one of them. You can see that the image, which is a little bit vague looking, but still clear enough to see, consists mainly of space, and with the idea that the actor, out of his presence, can evoke a space vaster than the space of an ordinary stage. I stress that because Craig's critics often say, impossible heights, but that's not what he meant. He meant an evocation of height by the human body, by the physicality of the human body. Our understanding of Craig's ideas becomes clearer when we realize that his work consists of two main ideas, not one. One of these ideas is his work as a stage director. While he had himself been a highly talented actor in his young years, his first pronouncement after becoming a director and directing several productions in London, his birth city, was that the acting we know is not an art, but rather a part of a larger art, an element within a larger art. And that this art, the theater itself, consists, quote, of action, which is the very spirit of acting, words, which are the body of the play, line and color, which are the essence of scene, and rhythm, which is the very heart of dance. This statement had a great influence on the modern theater, and particularly on the development of the director, which was largely unknown in our sense at the time Craig wrote those words. But it was the extent of Craig's influence. His other line of work consists of his research, about which there is still very little known. This second line of his work breaks from the theater and its traditions, from its plays, serious or comic, from operas or musical comedies, in order to make a differentiation between these forms which constitute the theater we know and that new entity which does not yet exist, called the art of the theater. It has to be created, or at least rediscovered, for its impulse, its inspiration, its laws, we could say, must have impelled the ancient birth of the theater in Egypt and in other regions, where the community participated in a ceremony, in a place before there was any differentiation between actors and spectators. From these laws, Craig believed, the theater had, through its history, wandered away. To find them out, to rediscover these laws, was what Craig proposed that a new community of actors and theater workers on all levels and spectators should join him to searching and seeking them out. A search, that's what he wanted to do. He wanted to seek out the unknown laws of the non-existent art called the theater. His aim was not to find some imaginary primeval past, but to induce the law's modern application through the means and efforts of enthusiastic followers, mostly young people, he stressed they should be. And remember that this was a period when there were very few schools of theater, not in universities and not independently. In this sense, there is a social note in this art of the theater. This new art would cease to be a meeting ground for other arts, such as writing, music, painting. These arts, he said, do not require the theater for their existence. The art of the theater, in its turn, will not require them, but will proceed from a hitherto unknown dynamic of its own. We have to remember that this idea is coming not from an aesthetician or a philosopher, but an actor. When I met Craig and became his pupil in Vence, in the south of France, I was 18 and he was 81. But he had not forgotten that when he was 18, in 1890, he was already an actor in the foremost company in London at that time, Henry Irving's company. And Irving's acting style in Shakespeare and modern plays, an extremely corporal one, a bodily one, as opposed to the predominantly verbal acting of the time, made such a permanent impression on Craig that when over half a century later, in 1945, Craig saw a mime performance in Paris by Etienne de Creux. We have a picture of it.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes, that's certainly Etienne de Creux. He was here in the States, and I'm not sure that he was ever here at your university, but he certainly was in California, and you'd have to look it up and find out where he was. So Craig saw de Creux's work in mime, in the new mime, and he wrote an article, Craig did, in English certainly, though it was published in French, called "At Last, a Creator in the Theater from the Theater." He meant, of course, by that, not a writer or a painter and so forth, but someone born out of the very depths of the theater itself, a new form of theater art, not dance, not ordinary acting, but the new mime. You may not know de Creux's name, though he was the teacher of other mimes whose name you might know, like Marcel Marceau. And yes, there are others, but none of them working quite so seriously and intently as de Creux himself. And Craig wrote, I can't repeat it word for word, but to this effect, he wrote, I realized that I was seeing an attempt made over years with a great passion to create an art for the stage. And when Craig says stage, it really means something, because he did not see the stage as a place to set up a play. He saw it as the source of an art, another source. Stage itself, the very word stage, meant to him ground which could take a new form and give forth and art, and in crediting Ducreux with having made strides in that direction, he was giving, I think, the greatest admiration and feeling of fraternity that he could give. Strange, though, talking about Henry Irving, a line stretching from an acting style in Victorian England to the advent of modern mime in France after the Second World War. But to rewrite the history of the theatre was part of Craig's intention to throw light on its physical history, its actors, its architects, as opposed to literature and playwrights. An example of this shift of emphasis is as follows. We are often told that the Elizabethan theatre, the theatre of Shakespeare, was not really a visual theatre, that the public came to hear what the actor would say, not to see what he would do or watch where he would go, nor that his surroundings carried any special visual significance to the public. But Craig, though no historian, perceiving out of his own passion, a word he liked to use a lot, suggests to us that this theatre was utterly visual, with a symbolic visual use of space, which was Shakespeare's and our legacy from the Middle Ages. The pulling aside of a curtain at the back, revealing a chair facing the public, which could be a king's throne, is sufficient for the forestage, which only a moment ago served for a street, to become the extension of the throne room. A visual dynamic linking not only with the theatre of the Middle Ages, but with the symbolism of the Orient, as in the Japanese no drama. This example alone could suffice to show us how the theatre has long been influenced by Craig's early revelations. And yet, despite this influence, his conscious aims were not to make stylistic reforms in theatre or in production, but to advance towards that new art of the theatre, which must be created from zero. Architecture, he said, is the art of space. Music, under which I include poetry, is the art of sound. The theatre must be the art of movement. An art of movement. No more words, Craig proclaimed. He was bitterly attacked for this. Craig's suppression of the playwright became a familiar expression in European theatrical circles. But the American dancer from San Francisco, Isadora Duncan, said that it was not words Craig was against, but their misuse. He wrote, "Words come quickest and easiest to lie with. Words must become blessed again after a century of silence." I should add that this art of movement, which he prophesied, must have enjoined in his thinking architecture, music, and movement in small, because he names its elements: scene, action, and voice. The art of movement would join the law of space, he said, to the fact that there is a law of motion parallel to the law of sound. The discoveries which could contribute to this art in formation would have to be made in an experimental theater, functioning in the form of a school. And this Craig was actually able to set up in Florence, in Italy, in an amphitheater, the Arena Goldoni, named for the playwright Goldoni, of long heritage in Italy. Well, through the help of the British Drama League, which I believe still exists, he was given funds to take over the Teatro Goldoni, the amphitheater, and the little rooms that could serve for offices around it. And if any of you go to Italy today, you can go to a well-known square where there is an ancient church, Santo Spirito it's called, and you'll see a movie theater there. And the movie theater is called the Goldoni. And it is that very amphitheater where Craig had his school, roofed over now. It's no longer open. And it has a plaque saying in Italian, which I don't remember how to say, but I'll say it in English. Here, Edward Gordon Craig created his school for the art of the theater. And if you look at this picture, well, you see two images there. The outdoor spectators section of the amphitheater, the standing tall figure is Craig. The seated figure is his first student, an American, Sam Hume. Later on, Sam Hume opened a bookshop which has been hailed as the best theater bookshop in history. And Sam Hume himself and the people who worked there claimed they could find any book on the subject of theater anywhere in the world. And people did indeed order their books there. I don't know San Francisco well, but I'm told that while Sam Hume is no longer alive, that the bookshop still exists. Whether it can lay claim to its capacity to get unknown theater books, I don't know, but I believe it's in San Francisco. It's amazing, you know, Craig was never in California. I mentioned earlier that the crew was, but Craig, never, so far as I know. He was in the States, but only as a young boy. And I don't think he ever was in California. And yet, this state produced people who were important in his life, like Sam Hume, and even more so Isadora Duncan, who was born in San Francisco as well. Well, almost surprisingly, this great school for the art of the theater that he founded lasted only a year and then closed and never reopened. Not there in the Goldoni or anywhere. You could say, why? Well, World War I came. The male students went back to their countries, particularly England, to serve in the armed forces. I even feel lucky to have a kind of brochure that was published in the school during that year, and the name in it was one of the group of original students from England, Ernest Marriott. And his family went on in life to become owners of a big chain of hotels, the Marriott Hotels, which you can find just about anywhere. But Ernest Marriott, whose name is in my brochure, was actually in the school during that one breathtaking year. Well, this was 1914, And Craig had already ceased to be an actor in 1897 when he was 25. His thoughts turning to the production of plays. In London, in a hall in Hampstead, in the early years of the 20th century, the productions Craig staged in the hall in Hampstead became a kind of obscure revolution. I say obscure because the people who went there were relatively few. Craig could rarely fill up the seating capacity, but the very people who went there were in a position to totally grasp and understand his thinking, his ideas, his going away from realism that I'll say more about in a moment. One of them was the poet Yeats, the Irish poet, who made a point of being there sometimes for the same production over and over again. And he wrote about those productions. Craig stripped the stage of naturalistic and realistic scenery, details meaningless to action. Look first not to nature, he said, but to the play itself. At this time, the realists were taking a stand against the artificiality of the 19th century theatre. Craig's theatre was taking a stand against that artificiality too, but also one against realism. His was a third position. Props, very few, significant and changeable in the action, and able to reflect light changingly. As a play's emotions change constantly, imperceptibly changing, without any regard to static surface realism. At that time in London, there was a Professor Herkimer who, together with students, conducted demonstrations on a model stage of how an effect, like sunlight or moonlight, could change imperceptibly, an evolving atmosphere like that of nature. To many, these experiments were just another way of adding to the prevailing trend towards realism. But to the young Craig, this change in place and surrounding suggested what was chief in his mind, the advent of a stage with a life of its own, a stage no longer static, a stage no longer a vehicle for scenery, but capable itself, the very architecture of the stage, of taking new forms and taking them, as I said, imperceptibly, and reflecting light to which the actors could relate as musicians relate to sounds. But the road leading to this great idea would cover a vast distance. Like every artist, he looked for reflections in the past, which could be references upon which to base his own work's future continuation. If he was an actor and the son of an actress, he was also the son of an architect who died when he was a child and who he had barely known. But when the 5 books of an Italian Renaissance architect and designer came into his hands, he found a source that would inspire him in his own work, and Italy became the very symbol to him of the country that would have that essence in it, that thing he had to find. The architect was Sebastiano Serlio, and almost remarkably, these 5 books of architecture by Serlio have been recently reprinted, and they are incredible to look at, fascinating to read, even though many of them were never realized. But that seems to be an Italian problem, coming up with greatness in ideas that were not realized in actuality, like Leonardo da Vinci, for example. Well, Craig decided then and there to leave England. He would go to Italy, even though it was centuries later. He stopped off in Germany, and he did direct a little-known restoration play called Venice Preserved by Thomas Otway. He directed that in Germany and then went on to Italy, where he met a famous Italian actress whose name some of you might know. Amazingly, she made films, early silent films, so that one can see her acting as much as it's representative in a film, the way they were made at that time. Choppy and difficult to look at. But she engaged him, Craig. She wanted him to direct her, though they didn't use that word then, to direct her and her company in a play by Ibsen, Rosmersholm. It's rather remarkable how Ibsen, who is considered so much a realistic writer, Craig saw as one of the few playwrights he could identify with. He saw the writing not as realistic at all, but as symbolistic. I don't know how many of you might know Ibsen's plays, but it's something to think about when you read them. I agree with Craig. I think they are really symbolistic. And in this production of Rosmersholm, Craig was confronted with a company that, apart from the idea about realism in play, they thought that realistic reforms in theater were what they were devoted to. And they expected to see a living room on the stage, complete with tables, chairs to sit in, pictures on the wall, teacups on the shelf, and a little window with a view outside. In fact, Eleonora Duse, the actress, oh, we have a picture of her. Yes, thank you. She herself expected this, not because she really championed realism, but it was what was the happening thing, the coming thing, and everyone expected realism. Well, Craig emptied the stage of all of this, except for one vast window. And the light streaming towards the window and through the window would give a feeling that in front of the window seemed to appear all the doubts and fears of man, and beyond it, all man's aspirations. The company, and as I say, including Duse, had never seen the like before. And there was no director by name. Duse was the director, but she was busy playing the role of Rebecca West, one of the largest roles in the play, so that everything was pretty much in Craig's hands and would have to be done, including the rehearsals, in a few days. That's all there was in time. I'm just interjecting this in brackets. Imagine that Craig took 3 years to direct Hamlet in the Moscow Art Theater. And here we are with maybe 3 days to direct a play. But that was the situation. And Duse, who had
much instinct as an actress, threw aside the detailed costume, contemporary costume that she was going to wear with all jewelry and all kinds of little accoutrements, and put on a kind of semi-transparent, very lightweight gown and moved like an apparition through Craig's stage to the window, away from the window. The company simply looked as if they had wandered on by mistake. But Duza was ecstatic and proclaimed that this was indeed the beginning of a revolution, that Craig must stay with them, that their whole theatre would have to change. Unfortunately, such enthusiasm often gives way to outside pressures. Craig and Duza's collaboration was forced to end with Grossman, with that one production. But nevertheless, perhaps while the battle was raging and then did not work out, Craig went on making plans for further work with Duza and the company. And one of his projects was for Sophocles' Electra. And I have two designs for that. The figure, who I think you can recognize all the way downstage, is Eleanor Duza as Electra. And in Craig's plan, she would not move. She was still. But remember that for Craig, stillness did not mean lifelessness. It meant that all the intensity of movement was stemming from the center of the body, and like sun rays go through the person, who would move very little or not at all. Beyond that, he went to the chorus. The chorus would be not a chorus, but individuals speaking to one another. Really the reversal of the typical treatment of Greek plays that we are used to even today, that we see. But the main thing that I wanted to show you, the second picture.
I'm not 100% sure I've landed on the right one. I think this is Rosmersholm.
I hope.
Let me see, where are we? This is right.
That's still the first one.
Right, and then this
That's
is,
the second.
That's it, definitely.
That's the second. And I think you'll notice that it's basically the same place, though obviously a very different scene. But here is the important thing. Look at the shadow reflections in the background. They are still from the first scene. They anticipate changes that we thought or think could only be done in the movies. But he already perceived something that he rarely spoke about. I think hardly spoke about at all. But it was that anything that we see, just like anything that we hear, takes time to reach us. When you see something happening, your eyes perceive it after it has happened. Well, that is the simple truth. We say, what do you mean? I see it while it's happening. No, it takes time. Such a minute amount of time that we wouldn't credit it, but it's time, real time. It takes time. And he anticipates and expresses that in having a whole scene still present for us while a new scene is happening and overlapping.
Harvey, I'm just asking, because that's very interesting. So this shadow that we see in the back is actually from the preceding scene.
That's right.
And how would he arrest it? He would have somebody in the, how did he do it?
Well, he would have it done simply by shadow reflections on the background produced with
the light.
as the lights are done, as the lighting is done. so the shadows would be done. But usually when you see shadows with lighting, it's just a shadowy area, whereas he shows the image.
The actual
Yes,
figures.
and of course, in real life, things take much less time to reach our eyes, but the idea of it is there. And once someone asked me, in fact, in Paris, how did I think, or did I think, that Craig's ideas related to the movies, to cinema of any kind. And I gave this as an example of it, because I think it is that. And this was, as I say, a plan. Maybe Electra would have followed Grossman's home, but nothing followed Grossman's home, because the work with the company did not continue. And yet, Craig did not leave off living in Italy. He entered one of the most productive periods of his life, following the production of Grossman's home in 1906, and ending with the closing of his school in 1914. His discovery in Italy of the Commedia dell'arte, the time of the great improvising actors of Renaissance Italy, led him to the idea that actors as we know them are the puppets of playwrights, compensating for their with their personalities for a lack of art, And so that he gave the Commedia dell'arte the era of Italian improvisation as a recall of a time when actors had a more artistic practice based on improvisation, about which, for the most part, we know very little or have a different view of what improvisation means than what the Commedia dell'arte knew and what Craig recognized. And yet this enthusiasm of his for the Italian comedy mystified people who had read that first text that he wrote about action, words, line, color, and rhythm. Because in it, he had added that in an artistic theater, an actor must, at any instance, be seen at a certain angle, struck by a certain light, at a certain place on the stage. The opposite, surely, of improvisation. Most of the time when I was with Craig, I just listened to what he would say and often take notes. But one day I dared to ask a question, the first time, but I venerated him and remember that I was still a teenager. And I told him that I admired a design of his called Enter the Army. I had seen it in color, though it's often reproduced in black and white. And at first he seemed not even to remember what I was talking about. Then he remembered it. And this is the design. Yeah. Yes. And he remembered it. And he said to me, which I was very proud of and happy to hear from him. I wrote it down. He said to me, what you mean is a flight of archangels. But he said, it's very different to realize on stage. He said, when I tried to do that or the equivalent of that, he said, there would be one actor, and this is very English, but maybe you'll get the tone. He said there would be one actor who would be looking out into the house to see if Nellie is in the stalls. Well, of course, I don't think any of us here would think that it's impossible to do that. I mean, there have been forms of training for actors that have been able to trust actors to be part of an image in this sense, but he hadn't experienced that at all. He even went as far as to say, I could never get actors to do it. He said, he considered that an actor might become uncomfortable even just standing still on the stage, that an actor in the ancient theatre, like in Greece, might not, but a modern actor might. So that a modern actor might think, not being directed or thinking for himself, but just at the moment he might think, I must do something, a step or two, a turn around, there, I've done something. But that something, Craig would have concluded, is not to the point. It is characteristic of art, I believe he would have said, that it hits the nail on the head. It is always to the point. There must be no action that is an alternative to standing still, nor any action done only for its own sake. Only the action vital to the context makes the point. And the first point for the actor, he would surely have said, is no action at all. It is presence, plain presence. That very presence which an actor in some bygone age might not have found uncomfortable, but which a modern actor might. And Craig quoted a French expression, action is a way of spoiling something. And he came forth with an essay called The Actor and the Über-Marionette. Craig borrowed the word über from the German philosopher Nietzsche, but this was a generation before the distortion of Nietzsche by the Nazis. The word über, as Nietzsche and Craig employed it, means over or beyond. The actor must get over or beyond the substitution of personality for the impersonality of art. Craig appeared to be saying in so many words that the actor is too personal, too given to the ups and downs of the human flesh, to give form to the impersonality of poetic inspiration. Quote, the actor must go, he said. Quote, in his place comes the inanimate figure, the Über-Marionette, we may call him, until he has won himself a better name. When Craig says inanimate, as I told you before, he does not mean lifelessness, though he does mean still, that breathless state of arrest between movements which we associate with sculpture. And then the movement, not this or that movement, but the only possible movement that is impelled by the directional drive of the figure. Not ordinary stage movement, not really, but transported immobility. The impact of Craig's vision reached its peak when he indicates that this was a conclusion the actor would come to himself, a destiny. Undoubtedly, we read that the actor is to be replaced by a figure of wood or some other material. Yet in another writing afterwards, he says that his statement is actually a position of war, that he does not want the living actor to be replaced by a thing of wood. Quote, "Did you expect to see real strings? The strings that descend from divinity to the soul of the poet might command the Übermarionette." Yet, he never denies that the actor is too personal to represent the impersonal in art. We are left at an impasse. No figure of wood, no human actor. What or who is going to perform? Craig scarcely knows. The situation clarifies a little when we realize that by the Übermarionette, Craig speaks of a figure, forgetting just for a moment whether wood or flesh and blood. Into this figure is imbued the spirit of art. If human, the spirit entering the actor is the spirit of Michelangelo entering matter, and the body of matter responds, the stone knowing the form that the carver imparts it. Sculpture become alive in all its fibers and informed by a creative spirit. The Übermarionette is also a being who is actor and director at once, who overrides their distinction in a theater in which an instant-to-instant inspired creation succeeds over pre-prepared impersonation and representation. It is improvisation. But the other side of improvisation, as each stroke of Michelangelo's chisel is an essay into the unknown, each sound of Beethoven's music, a hovering question as to which sound must follow. Improvisation and the achievement of form become one in the action of the Übermarionette. This is no notion on Craig's part, but a vision visited upon him. In a private note, he writes, quote, "All night will the world travail, and in the morning comes the Übermarionette." To the world, he states, the Übermarionette is the actor, plus fire, minus ego. Now, still in Italy, Craig finally comes to grips with his idea for a stage. Even though the idea of a new stage had been in his head already for 15 or 20 years. I'll try and trace for you in a few seconds questions churning in Craig's mind over a very long time. Scenery and stage. Why should there be any distinction between them? Because scenery changes and the stage is permanent. In the Greek and Roman theaters, the stage was also the scenery, a permanent scenery. On the more modern stage, scenery changes, whether from play to play or within a play. A third stage is required, one which has the durability of the ancient theater and the mobility that the modern drama requires. The Italian in the Renaissance, Serlio. Is that what we've got? Yeah, that's it. It looks a little bit like a checkerboard, but you'll notice that the squares rise and can move to different heights. And Serlio includes this in that book of designs I mentioned to you. It all stems from the floor and height, the rising up, the rising down. And Craig was very inspired by that. In fact, I find, I don't know what you think, that it's amazing that it was the 16th century. The design itself, the way Serlio draws it, looks very modern to me. It was, Serlio called it a cubic room. Craig, observing the design, was spurred to the idea of a new stage, a durable stage that possesses the nature of change. Studying the habitats of man at different times, in different places, Craig observed that there were always many decorative attributes that changed from one time to another, from place to place. These, he decided, the new stage could dispense with, but a more fundamental attribute, which should become the feature of the new stage, would be the right angle. That angle formed when we stand on the floor or on a supposedly flat earth. Of course, we know that the earth curves imperceptibly, but if we stand on it, thinking of it as flat, it forms that right angle. And that angle is formed in our Western civilization very much when two walls meet, when wall and ceiling meet, or wall and floor. These form an architectural setting for man, just like Serlio's cubes can evolve and change, and the architectural setting can change from instant to instant, again, as the emotional tones in a play can change, or as the sun rises or sets, imperceptibly, but always in movement, an innate movement. Again, the individual figure who is immobile and yet has the dynamism, the motor of movement in the body, in the center of the body. It's all the same thing, really. Human being, scenery, it's always searching for that innate motor, which is not in a demonstrative movement, but which is in the being, in the body. When I told you earlier that Craig was so impressed and surprised by Etienne Ducroux, the mime, it was because Ducroux was working utterly, I would even say only, with that principle. In counter rhythm with an actor's movement, the cubes or screens, because that's what Craig eventually would use for the rectangular shapes that he would have a stage made of. Not just place them on a stage, but have the stage composed of them. You'd walk into a room and there'd be no stage there at all. But in the emptiest part of the room, screens would be set up in one form or another that could evolve constantly into different forms. Vast corridors opening suddenly to the view. I brought you only one design, that's it, because I thought if I show you a lot of them, it just begins to look like different pictures but you can see already that change is happening, presumably because of lighting. A screen might move into light, or light move into the scene, and change without the light reading even having been changed because of the intervention of a screen surface. And as you can imagine, it's totally endless, the variations that might come, and in spirit, utterly different than a static, set-up stage arrangement, which we often call a scene or scenery. Well, in Craig's plan, the plain walls or squared blocks are of neutral tone, not because there is no color, but they can be painted constantly and only by light, changing light, evolving light, mixtures of light. A stage with a life of its own. How would this be affected? Well, you know, it's worth saying because I've more than once had people who I talked to about this scene, and even on a more important occasion where I used the scene itself, worked with screens. I had people say, imagine what Craig would be able to do today with computers and digital means. It's not true. He would have been against it. He wanted nothing automatized, or however you say it, automated. He gave an example. He said about writing. He said first the world used reed pens, and then feather pens, and then steel pens, and so forth. And you could get somewhere because you could dip a pen in ink and write a whole letter without once having to dip the pen in ink. And then, finally, someone invented the typewriter. Now, of course, I'm talking about a book he wrote in 1923. There was no computer to speak about, but the typewriter. He said no, he would not compare his scene to the typewriter because the pens were in the hand, and you had the impulse and action of the hand coming out constantly in the letter. What makes somebody's handwriting, somebody's personality? And he compared his moving scene, or the better term that he only rarely used, movemented stage. Than that. When we say moving stage, we often think moving from one stage to another. Never did he think that. There is only one stage. But the stage is nothing but movement. Well, one thing I discovered, I worked with screens, which are the simplest device with which he put his idea into action. I worked with them in Portugal, and some very well-meaning colleagues tried to show me how it could all be done with a device like children's electric trains. And I found out from trying that and from practice that no mechanical way of moving them is as expressive as when an actor, just now blocked from view by a double screen, a screen and an adjacent one in our perspective, grasps the screen to move it along the floor from behind it, continuing unbrokenly the earlier begun slow movement from behind by another actor who now appears before it, not because he makes an entrance, but because the screen moves beyond him, and therefore he comes into the spectator's line of sight. I'll tell you in a moment a little more about it, but through Isadora Duncan's effort, because you can imagine that people knew about Craig, but were slow to hire him to do anything because it was so radical. But she persuaded Stanislavski to invite him to Moscow, and because he had been experimenting with Hamlet, he said he wanted to do Hamlet. And Stanislavski said, you can take a whole year to direct it. The truth is, it took him 3 years. Stanislavski went along with it from year to year because he so felt the meaning of Craig's work, though he was in despair because actors would quit. They would say, it takes far too long and most of it is impossible. A young girl playing Ophelia bellowed out, no actress could do it, and she quit. So when they got through it, only a fraction of the cast had been there from the beginning. But when Craig explained that he even wanted the farthest upstage section to be visible with tiny screens, as if seen across distances, across vast territories. You would say, well, how could the actors be small enough for those screens? They wouldn't be, they would be marionettes, real marionettes, not Uber marionettes, real marionettes. And Stanislavski threw his arms in the air and said, this is for another millennium. Well, the truth is, this is another millennium now. We got there. And Craig did not use the marionettes in Moscow. Stanislavski said, nobody will understand the idea, critics won't understand it, we've never done anything like that. But I actually directed Hamlet according to Craig in Portugal, in the University Theatre, in the Beira Interior of Portugal. We toured it later with the screens, and we used marionettes upstage. And I think Craig, if he could see it, would have been very gratified, I think. Maybe he did see it. In any event, because it involves my own direct work with Craig's means, I wanted to tell you about that production. Well, to this idea of the movemented stage, the moving scene, Craig consigns the scene portion of the new art of the theater of scene, action, and voice. I have the idea, and I may be wrong, that he wanted to follow this book, Scene, with one called Action and one called Voice. If I'm right, he never did it, though he could have. I mean, the book was written fairly early. It was written when he was middle-aged, and he lived and was active while he lived until the age of 94. But he did not write those things. His idea for the ghost in Hamlet is worth talking about because his real idea for it was that it should be not one figure, but a chorus of figures. There too, Stanislavski was obliged to draw the line. He couldn't do it quite like that. He did compromise Craig did with Stanislavski on that in letting the ghost exit, let's say, stage left, and then immediately re-enter stage right, played by another actor. That had a small element of the choral idea. The main point about the choral idea was a transfiguration of life, which would not be pulled by gravity, in which movement would take on a form out of gravity, as if actors were walking in the air or walking in water some way. And he worked with them on that. And one of the things he admired much later from Etienne Ducroux, was in French, the marche sans accent statique, a walk without a static accent. And it was indeed such a walk, a mimetic walk, a walk out of the mime principle.
Harvey, I'm noticing we're fast approaching. We have half an hour more, and then the class will have to go to their next class. And I'm just wondering whether we should.
Oh, we are
break
close
for,
to. I have a habit of that.
Well, I'm just wondering whether we should open for some questions and comments, because people may want to ask you some more questions.
Yes, indeed, let's do it. I don't want to oblige you not to. Whoever has a question or even just a thought. Yes?
I was wondering if, and I have no idea on this front, whether you know if Edward Gordon Craig ever worked directly or met Ariane Minushkin.
Did he ever what?
Meet Ariane Minushkin, or whether she ever worked directly with him.
No, I don't think so.
I mean, the reason I ask that is because she did this sort of Uber marionette Bunraku performance where she actually has actors as the Bunraku puppets as opposed to marionettes. And then she did sort of the scale where she would have them transfer as they went great distances into actual marionettes.
When you say the scale, you're talking about the size of the figure?
I mean distance. So to give the appearance of distance, figures further off would be actual marionettes, and then when they came up, they would be puppets that were, or they would be people that were being manipulated by marionetteurs.
I see.
In catalogs.
No, I don't believe he ever did that,
Okay.
or even thought about it. The fact is that you would almost be amazed, or you would be amazed, if you would know the degree to which he was negatively criticized for even bringing up the subject of a marionette in relation to the actor. And when he went to Moscow, people said he shouldn't work with Stanislavski. He should work with Meyerhold, who developed a system called biomechanics, which people interpreted the Uber marionette as resembling. But the truth is that Craig didn't want to work with Meyerhold, and Stanislavski did want to work with Craig, even though they fought young.
Interesting question, because he died in 1966, I believe, right? So, and I think, there could have been some
There
overlap.
could have been overlap, and I mean, she was.
Yes,
Theater was
maybe
in
in the just the mentality of our time,
right.
there was, even if it wasn't that conscious.
And I mean, that was the thing, is I didn't even know if it was a direct nod to him from her, or whether it was just kind of in the zeitgeist and she just pulled it out.
Great subject for research in the paper.
Well, people would say, who is this Uber marionette? What does the Uber marionette look like? What is it? And I had one experience that I remember. I don't know if anybody knows the Italian Renaissance painter named Piero della Francesca. Craig had a book from Francesca's frescoes, and it has figures in it, the way the painter paints them in that book. And Craig had written in the book, the painter of Uber marionettes. So somehow I saw them as resembling those figures. And I think the lack of any suggestion of mechanical means of any kind is significant in that. Is it?
Great question. Let's hear more. Points to clarify or concepts that you may have worked with that you wanted, you have a great opportunity, or things from Harvey's talk. Yeah.
So you mentioned that you started working with Craig when you were 18, and he was 81. But how did you get to know him? Where did you meet him? How did you become his pupil?
Yeah, I still didn't understand your main point. How does he?
How did you meet Craig for the first time?
Oh, how I met him. Well, I told you how I discovered him when I was 14, and then when I was 17, I wrote an article about him, which a little Boston magazine called Chrysalis, it doesn't exist anymore, I believe, wrote the thoughts that I had, or my understanding of reading him. I hadn't met him. The thing I wrote in that book, which at the time was the only understanding I had, and I said it in the book, was that I knew that Craig was very interested in the use of masks in the theater. He praised the ancient theater for its use of masks, and he said, but a new mask, the mask that should return to the theater, should not be an imitation of the ancient masks. And his phrase was, it should be a creation, not a copy. And so when I had to say something about the Übermarionette, I said that I believed that it was the same as the mask, that it was like an extension of the mask until it became the whole being. Well, there is a French scholar who writes about Craig a lot. His name is Patrick Leboeuf. He was here, nearby, when I met him, this Patrick Leboeuf. He was at Pomona, where we had a kind of Craig weekend, and he came from France. And he found a copy of that article when I was 17, and he wrote, and I found it by chance. I didn't have the publication he wrote it in. He wrote that he thought the reason I had a rapport with Craig was because I didn't say anything about the Übermarionette with which Craig disagreed. So apparently I had hit it right at 17. The way you can hit things right when you're 17.
And then Harvey, so how did it work? I think, how did you just knocked on his door one day?
Oh, you mean
how did you literally meet
yes.
him there?
Well, the thing is, I wrote him, I had his address, and I wrote him that I would come. And I took a little Dutch boat, student ship, they used to call them, to France, to Paris, and then hitchhiked out to Vence in south of France, which took me 3 days to get to. And he knew that I was coming, if he remembered it. But I walked up some steps, and on my right was his door, and on my left was a window. And I walked up the steps, and I intended to knock on the door, when suddenly he opened it, and I knew it was him. Very tall figure. He was in his 80s. And I greeted him, and he invited me in, and he said something which was not true, but I felt very flattered by it. He said, and it's a sort of funny line, I'll tell you, well, it isn't really funny. He said, I think you look rather like me. Remember, I was 18. He said, you must be a son of mine. The truth is, he had 22 children, at the latest count. And so I guess it wouldn't have been impossible, though of course it was not true. I remember what he said to me that first day, and I wrote it down. he said, I quote, "My idea has become obscured, but it will be rediscovered. A poet will rediscover it." That's what he said. And then from then on, I stayed with him. Usually the work we did was in the earlier part of the day. He spent quite a bit of time with me on his plans for Shakespeare's The Tempest. And he explained that the reason he worked on and off on The Tempest through his life was because Coleridge, the poet, had written 100 years earlier, The Tempest should never be presented on the stage, ever, because the devices it requires are not possible. And he took that as a challenge. So he worked on it on and off all his life, though never directed it anywhere. But he showed me drawings and plans, and that was very important to him. And I always thought in my life, well, one day I'll direct The Tempest and use all the notes I made and the things I remember. But until now, I never did. But I may be able to this coming year in Germany. Maybe they'll have me direct The Tempest, and I'll call it a Craigian Tempest, if it happens, I hope. Yeah.
Great questions. What else? More thoughts? Yes.
How did Craig, I mean, to your knowledge, feel about like the other reactionaries to naturalism and realism, like Brecht or Zara?
How did he
feel about the other those other directors that were kind of working in in opposition and reaction to naturalism and realism, like Brecht or Zara?
I never heard him speak about Brecht at all, though I think it's sure that he must have heard of Brecht by that time, of course. But I never really heard him speak about other directors and admiring or not admiring them. I know of one famous director who tried to take a lot of his ideas, and did, but misused them. And about him he wrote negatively, and maybe you know his name, Max Reinhardt. Yeah, Reinhardt even invited him to direct a play, himself to direct it, but he refused. He felt he was being wrongly used by Reinhardt. Anybody else? And it doesn't have to be a question. Maybe you have a thought. Yeah.
I'm moved that he did these woodcuts, that he was so obsessed, or it seems to me, it occurred to me, this guy had these images and it wasn't enough to paint them or draw them. He had to cut them into wood to make them, and they're beautiful.
Yes, when he was still a boy, he was lucky enough to meet, I think I've got the name right, two names, James Nicholson and also James Pride. And they taught him woodcutting. And he practiced it all his life. And he taught it to his son. And in fact, there's one woodcut that I really prize, and it's here. Maybe we can find it.
Is it the King Lear? 'Cause
Yeah.
I have the King Lear up.
Yeah. It so anticipates De Croo, the work in mind of De Croo. And something to say about it, which is significant. All those lines in the back, he didn't mean that they would be there. He meant that that's the storm in King Lear being evoked by the actors. And the drawn lines in the woodcut, so to speak, are just trying to record it some way. But the action, look at the actors, look at their bodies. It's an impulse more than a movement in the usual sense.
So an actor in his world would have to have a background in mime or that sort of movement?
Yeah, or at least be guided into it by a director, a way of working. It's a way of working. In the Hamlet that I spoke about, that I did, the action really did look like that, and the costumes were largely what we would call dance costumes, leotards, tights, and the equivalent, which could allow the body to perform these actions visibly. But of course, it's what evokes, what is evoked, what comes out from the actor, not what comes in from scenery. It's a reversal.
Well, in that regard, I'm very taken by this idea that the actors are the ones to manipulate the screens.
That's right.
That it's not, stage hands or anything like that.
Exactly.
It's the actors who are motivating. And it's interesting because you think about a lot of very contemporary theater techniques. Think about the viewpoints method and Bogart's work. Where the actors themselves become very, very aware of the architecture and how they work within that architecture. And it doesn't get synthesized in terms of psychological motivation or anything like that. It's that they are animating, that their spirit is part of this larger
Yes,
project.
it really changes everything. And there begins to be a very thin line, if any, between actors who you cannot see because there happens to be screens in front of them at that moment, and then the screens moving enough away so that you can see them. But it's not that now the actor will do something because he's seen. Whether seen or unseen, it's the same dynamic. That's the thing that he perceived and which he found a reflection of in Ducreu's work.
And can I ask you, Harvey, do you have any theories on how come there were so many Americans in his life?
I never had a theory about that, but again, there weren't that many. It's just that
But
the two I
significant.
mentioned,
And you
and the third,
you're
and
the
there's more. There's Alvin Epstein, I mentioned,
Right,
and his
right.
brother Mark,
right?
both of whom lived and worked in this region. Trying to think, yeah, there's a small handful of others. It may have to do with the fact that a good side of us Americans is the sort of rather revolutionary spirit that informed our coming over as colonials. Even though certainly there was a lot of evil too that came over, as we know, like reflected in Arthur Miller in The Crucible, for example. That's what I, when you ask it, I think of that. I never even thought of it.
Yeah.
But
It's interesting.
yeah, that's the only thing I can think of. There were Europeans too,
Yeah, I imagine.
but European thinking, I used to only prefer European thinking. That was why I chose to go to Europe. But lately I've changed. Anybody else?
David has another.
One of the most moving things you talked about for me was these lines going from the marionette to what? The soul,
Yeah,
the
did you
spirit.
expect to see real strings? Yeah.
Exactly. So that seems to me to be an aim in this theater of art, to connect authentically with this soul
Yes.
connection.
Yes,
So in the
sorry.
process, did he believe in a collaboration? Was it the director? Who was the arbiter of how, of on or off, ego, no ego, in this performance? How was that arrived at?
That's very difficult to just
I know.
answer you. No, I mean verbally.
Yes.
But it is the main point. The entire thing from Craig is, and the reason he's called a visionary, people who are aware of him, is because it is totally of the soul. It springs from the soul. And that is not so, I believe, in the theater that we know. It simply is not. That's why it was so difficult for him to fit into the theater. In fact, remember, he came from a theatrical family, very theatrical family, going back generations on his mother's side. And yet, he himself said, in relation to his idea, he said that it's actually not the theater. He said, it's a new form of art. He meant the soul. That is what he meant. He didn't use that word. I don't know if he ever used it, but it was certainly what he meant. But when he said that, oh, he also said, but out of a certain loyalty, he said, I'll continue to use the word theater. Yeah.
Final questions or remarks? Yeah, one
I
final.
mean, it's just a thought. It's not a question, but I mean, you already mentioned viewpoints, and then you mentioned mind work, and it kind of seemed like a lot of what he said about the evocation coming from the actor's body. A lot of it is similar to what Michael Chekhov talked about in his movement work. And again, well, I guess there is a question at the end there. I don't know. I mean, did they? Because there was also the overlap. There would have been overlap certainly between the two of them. Do you know if there was ever any interaction, or whether he had any even thoughts on the sort of Michael Chekhov's theories on movement of the body?
Yeah, yes, that's right. Michael Chekhov. No, I was trying to put it together. I know he has written a book about acting. I've never read it. I've seen him in films, so I know who he was. And of course, he's from the family of Anton Chekhov. But I can't compare it. I have never read his work.
Okay.
And the film that I saw him in, he had a kind of semi-comic role in. Maybe people have seen it, if only because he's in it. That's Spectre of a Rose. Did you see it?
Yeah.
I saw it only when it came out, and I was a kid.
Yeah.
But I would like to see it again. It's very rare to find it.
There's a new book by a researcher named Yana Mirzon, M-E-E-R-Z-O-N. If there was a connection, it would be named in that book.
Okay.
So that's a really interesting question. So again, another good research topic. Well, I'd like to really thank you so much, Harvey, and I'd like to thank everybody for being so attentive, for these great questions. We have a few minutes after we kind of officially dismiss. If you have questions or you wanted to address Harvey more personally, we have a few moments for that. But I really want to thank the class, and I hope that this will be helpful for you as you continue with your studies of theater history, and thinking about the ways in which one artist informs another artist's work, and how that kind of
Indeed.
keeps the process going. So please join me. Thank you so much, Harvey.
Yeah, thank you.